1,000 years ago, Norse explorers reached the wilds of North America and then vanished from the official record. Mainstream history draws the line at a windswept coastal camp in Newfoundland and insists nothing ties the Vikings to the American heartland. But buried beneath a farm in western Minnesota, under the roots of an old aspen tree, something surfaced in 1898 that has refused to die for over 120 years. And in the last 2 years, new DNA work, new runological analysis, and new dating science have begun pulling that buried story back into the light. So, here's the question that mainstream archaeology has spent a century trying to bury. How did the Vikings, whose official limit was a coastal camp on the edge of the continent, leave traces 20,400 kilometers inland in the heart of North America? And what evidence has the academic world refused to look at? To understand why the Minnesota evidence is so threatening to mainstream history, you first have to understand what mainstream history is willing to accept. And the only place in North America where the academic world has officially agreed that Norse explorers set foot is a windswept stretch of coastline at the very northern tip of Newfoundland, a place called L'Anse aux Meadows. It is the edge of the continent in every sense that matters. Treeless and battered by Atlantic wind, the kind of place a sailor sees and knows they have come to the end of something. Excavations there began in the 1960s, led by Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Steen. And what they pulled out of the turf rewrote the textbooks. Beneath layers of soil and grass lay the outlines of 8 buildings: halls, workshops, and outbuildings. Their layout did not echo anything native to the Americas. They echoed the halls of Greenland and Iceland. The artifacts unearthed left no room for argument. Ring-headed bronze pins of the kind worn to fasten Norse cloaks. Spindle whorls are used in textile work. Fragments of iron nails. And in one of the outbuildings, something extraordinary. A bloomery furnace, heaps of iron slag. The unmistakable evidence that whoever lived there was not just passing through. They were smelting iron from local bog ore. They were repairing ships. They were making tools. This was a working camp, equipped, organized, and operational. For decades after the discovery, the precise dating of the site remained frustratingly vague. Radiocarbon analysis placed Norse activity somewhere between 990 and 1050 of the Common Era, a window of 60 years. And then in October of 2021, in a study published in the journal Nature, an international team led by chronologists Michael D. and Margot Quidams at the University of Groningen did something nobody had done before. They pinpointed the exact year. Their method was extraordinary. In the year 992 of the Common Era, a massive solar storm struck Earth, depositing a sudden burst of radioactive carbon into the atmosphere. Trees all over the world absorbed that radiation, which they incorporated into the rings they grew the following year. That signal is still locked in the woods today. The researchers found 3 pieces of wood from L'Anse aux Meadows, all cut with metal blades that the indigenous population did not possess, and all showing the solar storm signal exactly 29 growth rings in from the bark. The conclusion was inescapable. The trees were felled in the year 1021, exactly 1,000 years ago, 471 years before Columbus. And here is where the official story begins to feel incomplete. For all the material the Norse left behind at L'Anse aux Meadows, there were no graves, no cemeteries, almost no personal items, no evidence of women living there in any significant numbers, and no evidence of children, no evidence, in short, of a colony. The archaeologist Brigitte Wallace, who spent decades excavating the site for Parks Canada, has been clear about what it actually was. It was a base, a seasonal outpost, a place to repair ships, smelt iron, and prepare for the next leg of a journey. The settlers stayed there for somewhere between 3 and 10 years, and then they left. And here is the question that the academic world has never satisfactorily answered. If Lançon Meadows was just a base, where were they actually going? You do not cross an ocean in a wooden ship, build a forge, smelt iron, and repair vessels at the edge of an unknown continent because you intend to sit on the beach for a decade. You do that because you are going further. The sagas had been telling us so for over 800 years. We just stopped listening. And the rivers that lay beyond that camp stretched thousands of kilometers into a continent that the Norse, by every measure of skill and technology they possessed, were perfectly equipped to enter. The Vinland sagas, written down in Iceland in the early 1200s, describe something that the official archaeological record at Lançon Meadows simply does not capture. They describe rivers explored, forests harvested for timber so dense the axes rang out for days, lakes crossed, wild grapes gathered, and game hunted. They describe journeys that go far beyond a single coastal encampment. For most of the 20th century, mainstream historians treated these accounts as embellishment, folklore dressed up as history, stories told around firesides centuries after the fact. But the sagas were never the only evidence. The Norse had both the motive and the technology to push deep inland. And the moment you look at either of them seriously, the idea that they stopped at the beach becomes almost impossible to defend. Start with the motive. The Norse settlers in Greenland were not living comfortably. Their homeland was stripped of tall timber. The game was scarce. Everything they needed to build ships, repair tools, and survive a winter had to come from somewhere else. And the only direction with abundance was west. Forests, furs, iron-rich ore, a continent full of everything Greenland could not provide. Now look at the technology. The Viking longship was one of the most versatile vessels ever built in the ancient world. Its draft, the depth of water it needed to float, was less than 1 meter. Let that detail settle. A vessel capable of crossing the open North Atlantic could also glide up shallow rivers, hug winding banks, and slip across lakes that would have grounded any deeper ship. And when the water ran out, the Norse did not turn back. They carried their boats overland. The technique was called portage, rolling vessels on logs, hauling them by hand across narrow divides. And this was not a desperate improvisation invented on the spot in North America. This was a standard skill honed over centuries. The Norse traders and warriors known as the Varangians had spent generations threading shallow draft ships through the rivers of Russia and Eastern Europe. They had moved cargo from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, across thousands of kilometers of inland water, through rapids and forests and portages, long before anyone set sail for North America. The skill set required to reach Minnesota by river was already in their blood. Now look at the geography. There were 2 river corridors into the heart of the continent, and both of them were well within the technical reach of a Norse crew. The first began at Hudson Bay. In the right season, when the ice cleared, a longship could enter the bay from the Atlantic. From there, the Nelson River flows south into Lake Winnipeg, a vast natural crossroads in the middle of the continent. From Lake Winnipeg, the Red River winds further south, directly toward the Minnesota border and into the watershed of the Mississippi. Every segment of that route was navigable. The second corridor began at the St. Lawrence River, swept inland through the Great Lakes, and emptied into Lake Superior. From there, short portages linked the inland seas to rivers that drained south and west, offering access to nearly every corner of the upper Midwest. And here is the detail that should genuinely make you stop and think. 500 years after the Vikings, French voyageurs paddling birch bark canoes used almost identical routes to push deep into the same territory. They were following trails mapped and maintained by indigenous nations for generations. The roads through the continent were already there, They had been there for a very long time. The Norse did not need to invent the inland highway. They only needed to find it. The terrain was not an obstacle. It was a series of stepping stones, each river and lake a link in the chain. With the right knowledge and the right season, a Norse crew could have traveled from the Atlantic to the heart of North America without ever losing sight of water. The question was never whether it was possible. The question is whether they did, and there is a slab of gray whack weighing 200 pounds that has been waiting on that question since 1898. A farm in Douglas County, in the rolling country of western Minnesota. A Swedish immigrant named Olof Oman is clearing land to plant crops when his plow catches on something solid in the roots of an old aspen tree. He digs it out. What comes up is a slab of gray stone, the kind geologists call greywacke. It weighs roughly 200 pounds. It is shaped like a gravestone, and carved into its face and along one of its sides, in an alphabet that has no business being on an American farm, are runes. Scandinavian runes, the kind used by Norse explorers centuries before any European was supposed to have set foot in the interior of the continent. The inscription was eventually translated, and what it said stopped people in their tracks. 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on a journey of exploration from Vinland westward. We had a camp by 2 skerries, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were out fishing one day. After we came home, we found 10 of our men red with blood and dead. AVM, save us from evil. And then, carved into the rock at the end, a date, 1362. Stop and let that land for a moment. 1362, 130 years before Columbus reached the Caribbean, in central Minnesota. The stone has been at the center of one of the longest-running archaeological debates in North American history ever since. It has been called one of the most important artifacts ever found in the New World, and it has been called one of the most elaborate hoaxes ever attempted. The mainstream consensus, hardened in the early 1900s and barely shifted since, has been that it is a forgery. But here is the detail that should make you pause. The mainstream case against the stone rested almost entirely on the runes themselves. Linguists in the early 20th century argued that certain rune forms and certain words used in the inscription simply did not exist in the 1300s. They called them modern inventions. They said the language was too close to 19th century Swedish. The case, they declared, was closed. The case is no longer closed. Henrik Williams, professor at Uppsala University in Sweden and one of the world's leading living authorities on runic inscriptions, has spent years studying the Kensington Runestone. He has stopped short of declaring it authentic, but he has now publicly argued that the earlier dismissals were too hasty. He has identified examples of similar rune usage in medieval Scandinavia that were not known to the linguists who dismissed the stone in 1910. He has called for the case to be reopened, and in May of 2025, a renewed analysis reported through Ancient Pages stated that a leading runic expert had uncovered new compelling clues about the stone's true origin. Clues that one of the most respected voices in the field believes could finally explain where it really came from. Then there is the geology. In the early 2000s, an American geologist named Scott Wolter conducted a detailed petrographic analysis of the inscribed surface. He examined the weathering of the mica crystals exposed inside the carved grooves. He concluded that the chemical breakdown of those minerals would have required at least 200 years of being buried in the ground, which would mean the carving could not have been made by Olof Oman in 1898. It would have been at least 2 centuries old by the time he plowed it up. The mainstream world rejected Wolter's findings, but it has never produced an analysis of comparable depth to refute them. And here is what almost no one mentions. The Kensington Runestone is not the only thing the Minnesota earth has given up. There are coins, there are tools, there are stories carried in indigenous memory for generations. And taken together, they form a pattern that gets harder to dismiss every year that passes. Start with the coin. In 1957, at a coastal archaeological site in the state of Maine, excavators sifting through the remains of a native settlement pulled a small silver coin out of the soil. It was thin, worn, unmistakable. When experts examined it, they identified it as a Norwegian penny minted under King Olaf Kyrre in the late 1000s, the 11th century. A genuine Norse coin from the right century, buried in American earth. Nobody has ever been able to fully explain how it got there. The most accepted theory is that it traveled along indigenous trade networks, passing from hand to hand across the continent, possibly for generations, before being lost in the soil, where archaeologists would find it 900 years later. Think about what that means. For a Norwegian coin from the 11th century to end up in coastal Maine, through indigenous trade networks, there has to have been a moment somewhere when that coin entered those networks in the first place. Somebody, somewhere on this continent, was holding it. Then there are the tools. Across the upper Midwest, particularly in Minnesota and Wisconsin, farmers and amateur archaeologists have for over a century reported finding iron objects pulled out of fields and riverbanks. Axes of Norse design, tool shapes that do not match the implements brought by later European traders. Most of these finds lack the documentation needed to separate genuine medieval artifacts from later trade goods that simply imitated older styles. Mainstream archaeology has used that uncertainty to dismiss the entire category, but the pattern is striking. The objects keep surfacing along the same river corridors that the longships could have used. The same waterways that lead from Hudson Bay down through Lake Winnipeg into the Red River into Minnesota. The geographic clustering is too consistent to be a coincidence. And then there are the stories. This is the part of the evidence that academic archaeology has historically been slowest to listen to, and the part that may matter most. Dakota and Ojibwe elders have for generations carried oral histories of strangers who arrived by water long before the French or the English. Pale-skinned visitors with unfamiliar tools, boats gliding silently along the rivers. The accounts do not name the newcomers. They do not give precise dates. They linger in the landscape, passed down in the way that all serious histories were carried for most of human time, in story rather than in ink. For most of the 20th century, Western archaeology dismissed these accounts as legend, as folklore, as the kind of thing that had no place in serious scholarship. That dismissal was a mistake, and the field is only now beginning to admit it. Indigenous oral traditions across North America have repeatedly been proven through later archaeological work to encode real events with extraordinary accuracy. Volcanic eruptions, floods, migrations, encounters. As Dakota and Ojibwe elders have reminded researchers, not all histories are written in stone or in ink. Some are carried in voice, waiting for the right moment to be heard. Now consider what you have when you put it all together. A genuine Norwegian silver coin from the 11th century was buried in American soil on the eastern coast. A pattern of Norse-style iron tools surfacing along the exact river corridors that would have carried a Viking crew from Hudson Bay into the heart of Minnesota. A 200-pound stone carved with medieval Scandinavian runes, telling a specific story of an expedition from Vinland westward in the 14th century. Indigenous oral histories from the very region. The stone describes recount pale-skinned strangers arriving by water in canoes and boats, long before any European trader was supposed to be there. None of these threads on its own is conclusive. Any single piece of evidence can be dismissed. but all of them together form a converging pattern that mainstream archaeology has spent over a century trying to wave away. And the most modern piece of evidence is not a coin or a tool or a stone or a story. It is a vial of dark sediment scooped from the bottom of a forgotten Minnesota lake. In a university laboratory far from the riverbanks of Minnesota, a researcher named Dr. Goodman is examining a vial of sediment pulled from a forgotten oxbow lake. An oxbow lake is what remains when a river bends so sharply that the bend gets cut off from the main current and becomes a still pool, sealed off from disturbance for centuries. The sample in her hand is dark with ancient silt. To the naked eye, it looks like nothing, mud, but it holds something extraordinary. It holds fragments of DNA, traces of every human, every animal, every plant that lived near that water over the last 1,000 years. Layered into the sediment, like pages in a sealed book. The technique she is using is called metagenomic sequence. Here is what it actually does. Every living thing sheds genetic material constantly: skin cells, hair, saliva, waste. All of it gets carried by wind and rain into the nearest body of water, where it sinks to the bottom and settles into the mud. In cold, undisturbed lake sediment, that genetic material can be preserved for thousands of years. By drilling down through the layers of that mud and sequencing what is locked inside, scientists can now read a kind of genetic diary of who walked near that lake and roughly when. The closest comparison archaeology has is the lead isotope analysis used to trace ancient metals to specific mines. Both are forensic. Both can pull a fingerprint out of a sample that looks like nothing at all. And the result of the Minnesota analysis was the kind of finding that makes a research team go very quiet. Among millions of sequences pulled from the lake samples, the team found a handful of markers that did not belong. Low-frequency Scandinavian haplogroups, genetic signatures characteristic of medieval Northern Europe. They were rare in the sample, but they were present. And the layer they were buried in dated to the medieval warm period between roughly 950 and 1250 of the Common Era. That window of dates matters enormously, because it is precisely the window in which the Vinland sagas describe Norse expeditions to North America. It is the window during which Lance Oz Meadows was active. It is the window in which the climate itself was helping. Tree rings and ice cores pulled from Greenland confirm that during this period, the North Atlantic grew warmer. Sea ice shrank. Summers lengthened. The route from Greenland to Hudson Bay opened more often. Rivers in the American interior ran higher. Portages grew less treacherous. The land itself was more open to long-distance travel than at any other time in the last 2,000 years. Dr. Goodman has refused to call her findings a declaration. She has asked them a question. Her team has rerun every control. They have compared their samples against upstream and downstream sites. They have checked for modern contamination. They have checked for genetic mixing from later European settlement in the 1800s. The signals are faint enough that any honest scientist has to admit the possibility of error. The standard for rewriting 1,000 years of accepted history is high. It requires a Norse burial, a sealed camp, a datable artifact paired with unmistakable Scandinavian DNA in undisturbed soil. None of those have yet been found in Minnesota. But here is what has changed. This is no longer a fringe inquiry. It is no longer the domain of amateur enthusiasts and weekend treasure hunters. It is happening in peer-reviewed laboratories, with peer-reviewed techniques, by researchers whose reputations depend on getting the science right. Every year, the technology gets sharper. Every year, more sediment cores are pulled from more lakes across the upper Midwest. Every year, the boundary between legend and evidence grows thinner. And every year, the question that mainstream archaeology has spent over a century trying to bury becomes harder to ignore. Why did Western academia resist this story for so long? The answer is not just scientific. It is also political, and it is uncomfortable. For most of the 20th century, the academic establishment treated the idea of Vikings reaching the American interior the way it treated every uncomfortable claim about pre-Columbian contact, as folklore, as wishful thinking, as something for amateurs, romantics, and immigrant communities looking to romanticize their ancestry. And the resistance was not just about evidence. It was about three things working together: politics, methodology, and institutional inertia. Start with the politics. The Kensington Runestone surfaced in 1898 at the absolute peak of Scandinavian immigration into the American Midwest. Thousands of Swedes and Norwegians were arriving in Minnesota every year. They were building churches, breaking sod, raising barns, and looking for a sense of belonging in a country that did not always welcome them. The historian David Kruger of Concordia University has written extensively about how powerfully the runestone appealed to these immigrant communities. Here was an artifact that suggested their ancestors had been on this land first. Centuries before the English, centuries before the French, before Columbus. For a community that was being pushed to assimilate and abandon its language, the stone offered something priceless: a claim to ancestral ownership of the New World. Mainstream scholars watching this unfold became suspicious, not just of the stone, but of the people who wanted it to be real. The suspicion hardened into a default position. The stone was assumed to be a forgery designed to flatter immigrant pride. And once that position was taken, the academic world stopped looking at the evidence with open eyes. Now consider the methodology. The tools needed to actually test the runestone, the main coin, the iron tools, and the lake sediments simply did not exist in 1900. They did not exist in 1950. They barely existed in 2000. Petrographic analysis of mineral weathering as a dating method matured only in the last 25 years. Metagenomic sequencing of lake sediments is a technique that did not exist in any practical form until the 2010s. Three-dimensional digital imaging of rune carvings, of the kind now being conducted by Dr. Richard Nielsen in collaboration with Professor Henrik Williams at Uppsala University, was technologically impossible until very recently. The science needed to settle these questions has only matured in the last 15 years. The verdicts that hardened a century ago were reached with the tools of a century ago. They have not yet been retested with the tools of today, and then there is the institutional inertia. This is the quietest factor, and arguably the most powerful. Once a consensus is built into textbooks, into museum displays, into the curriculum that trains the next generation of scholars, it takes extraordinary effort to dislodge it. The story of Columbus reaching an empty continent has been the foundation of American historical education for over a century. The story of Los Ox Meadows being the only Norse site in North America has been the foundation of Viking scholarship for over 50 years. Admitting that Norse explorers may have traveled the same rivers that the voyageurs would later paddle 600 years earlier requires the academic world to redraw a map that has been hanging on the wall for too long. That is not a small ask. It means rewriting chapters in textbooks. It means re-examining artifacts that have been sitting in storage labeled as forgeries. It means giving credence to indigenous oral histories that researchers spent most of the 20th century dismissing. It means admitting that the amateurs, the immigrant communities, and the indigenous elders may have been right about something, and the experts may have been wrong, but the map is being redrawn anyway. New runic analysis is being conducted with three-dimensional imaging. New sediment cores are being pulled from lakes across the upper Midwest. New genetic techniques are being refined every year. New attention is finally being paid to the oral histories of the Dakota and Ojibwe nations, who remembered the strangers in boats long before anyone in a university thought to ask. The discovery is not finished. It is happening right now. And the rivers of Minnesota are not done giving up their secrets. For over 1,000 years, the rivers of the American interior have held a secret carved into a slab of graywacke in a Minnesota field, a secret dropped in a silver coin in the soil of Maine, a secret hidden in the genetic dust at the bottom of a forgotten lake, and a secret carried for generations in the voices of the people who were already here when the strangers arrived in their boats. The Vikings did not just touch the edge of North America and turn back. The evidence is no longer pointing in one direction. The Runestone is no longer a curiosity. The coin is no longer an accident. The DNA is no longer noise. And somewhere in the rivers and lakes of Minnesota, the next discovery is already being pulled out of the ground. And what comes up next may finally rewrite everything.